That's me on the left, Jungle George. In the 80s, I lived with the Rastafarians of Westmoreland, South Jamaica. During this time of my youth, I kept a video diary of these extraordinary men and their families. This became exceedingly difficult as I was the first white person to live in this remote, undeveloped region of the island, a place they called the Land of Look Behind.
Greetings in the name of the Most High, Kings of Kings and Lords of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and the earth rightful ruler of things seen and unseen. Jah Rastafari, ever sure, ever leader.
Let me see, where to begin. I remember looking out over the Caribbean Sea that day, wishing I were back in Canada, as I had become terribly homesick.
Singing, live on for life, for leaders, live on for life. We live up on this life, for judge a cup and provide. I'm singing, live on for life, for leaders, live on for life. We live up on this life, for judge a cup and provide.
I had been living in the jungles for 6 months with James Somerville and Charles Cocker, who all the locals called Bongo Bada. It had taken me this long to feel comfortable enough to travel off the property. The language patois was difficult to understand, and the culture was far different from anything I had ever experienced in Canada. Bongo Bada had told me that in the mid-1930s, 13,000 men stopped cutting and combing their hair in a form of non-violent civil protest against certain laws at the time. The protest succeeded, and there are now well over 100,000 Rastafarians in Jamaica alone. Here we see the barracuda, one of the most dangerous fish in the Caribbean Sea. The gentleman holding up the fish proudly showed me his scars that reached from the back of his neck across his chest to the top of his hip. The gruesome scar took 120 stitches to close and was acquired when a barracuda that he had hooked jumped into his boat. He went on to tell me that one minute he was looking for dinner, the next minute he was the dinner. Luckily, 2 fishermen who were close by saw what had happened and were able to sew him up on the spot and save his life. Fruit from the jungle is highly praised along the coastal regions, such as cocoa pods, for their seeds inside. When beaten, they will produce some of the most delicious raw chocolate imaginable. Here's the jelly coconut for the pure sweet water and jelly cream. And the niceberry, a small wonderful fruit which tastes something quite of its own. The soursop, which tastes nothing like its name, not sour at all, but sweet and delicious. El reggae es en tu corazón cuando está encendido. Que no te gusta el reggae. There are many types of pineapple available on the island. This is a young pineapple first showing its flower. It didn't take me long to realize I wouldn't go hungry in Jamaica. Just look at the size of those green peas. They are so large, I have to use a tree to stake them up. Here is the #1 favorite of the island, the honey banana. This photograph was featured on the front page of the Woodstock Sentinel Review newspaper. We also carried with us a big piece of yam, which is a staple food of the locals. This is James Somerville, who had become my close friend over the months and confided in me that his family owned a beachfront property. This took us on a journey to South Broughton Hopeworth Beach, as he wished for me to see it. I had come to know James as a wonderful farmer and a trustworthy person, and was willing to travel with him into the undeveloped parts of the South Coast. Here we see him harvesting cucumbers to take with us.
Lighting the way for all to see, so we can do the same.
In its time, Jamaica has been owned and conquered by the Arawak, the Spanish, the British, and was finally home to the African, Chinese, and Indian slaves. Jamaica has become the island of travel legends, welcoming people with sun-kissed golden beaches and endless parades of color and fun. However, not far off the tourist trail, there's a unique culture of the Rastafarians. Commercial tourism picked up here in 1980, even after the political turmoil and unrest of the surrounding countries' independence in the 1960s and 70s.
Of a white man and a black woman, on the streets he used to run, yeah.
I remember James being very nervous around this time about leaving the garden. He was worried someone was going to steal his tobacco crop. I found people were very jealous of James's ability to grow gardens that would sparkle in the sun.
With the whalers band, and Rita and the sun.
Here we see the Moses bush. At certain times of the year, when the sun is just right, the plant will take on an appearance of a burning bush. Quite amazing, really, and I have only witnessed this event 3 times in my life. James was talking excitedly that day about his family, as he had not seen his 3 boys for some time, and was anxious to meet up with them. This picture here was also featured in the local newspaper article about the documentary. James talked about Jamaica being a small island about 90 miles south of Cuba. Although known for its long sandy beaches, its landscapes are breathtaking and diverse, from hills and crags to deep lush valleys and mountainous streams. The mountain range seen in the distance is called the Kentucky Heights Mountains. By 1980, oil prices had risen from $8 to $32 a barrel. Add to this the economic hardships and the campaign of gun violence by the PNP and the JLP. This again reduced tourism in Jamaica. I was glad I had a home in the mountains where I could hide if the riots were to ever come our way. James told me how Jamaica was a land of contrasts, and went on to say how beautiful the property could be if only the construction companies would quit stealing the sand from the beach.
Children sleeping on the ground. Mommy and daddy is nowhere around. We've got to find.
As we moved deeper into the South, I became to fully realize what it was like to be a minority. These 2 youngsters, as you can see, were very nervous around me.
It's the only way. Get ready. Come back with join the forces. People get ready.
Soon we were met by a representative of the local Rastafarian community and were immediately given the best of the hospitality. Fatty, as he was known, talked about the Americans' Watch report on human rights in Jamaica, which was on the radio that day. It had concluded that there existed in Jamaica a practice of summary executions by the police, unlawful confinement, and assaults on detainees. 15 years later, Amnesty International finds that these practices continue.
Me witnessing a man sleeping underneath the interstate, and I thought to myself, there's no place in this world for a poor man.
After dinner, I watched the sunset and went to bed early thinking about what Fatty had said. I fell asleep quickly and was well rested for the tour of the property, which I took at first light.
Ain't no place for a poor man.
I was impressed to see hundreds of coconut trees ranging from 10 to 50 years old, with lots of banana and other local fruits.
No, 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 no. There ain't no place in this world.
The beach was incredibly beautiful, but was dark in color that day from the rain that had fallen that night.
Place in the world, y'all, for a poor man.
Soon vines would grow and the beach would explode with purple flowers that were spectacular to view against the purple bluish sky. Here we are planning construction of my home and waiting for the surveyor to show up. During our inspection of the property, we came across a stretch of beach that had been stolen the night before and taken to Negril to be used in the construction of tourist resorts. James was concerned the tourist industry would never reach this place as long as the sand was constantly being stolen. We devised a plan to build a fence and post warnings to the effect that we would prosecute any more persons found digging sand. We all got together and built a fence out of wood that we acquired from the jungle.
One world, one nation, one rainbow kingdom.
I found it was cheaper at this time to have the fence wire shipped in from Canada. So I had numerous rolls imported, but they never became fencing. We found the wire a much more useful material for building fish traps. Unfortunately, before we could get the fence up, Iru, James's youngest brother, caught 3 men stealing sand and got into a terrible fight with them. He won the battle, but received a terrible bruise which can easily be seen on the side of his face. This injury was caused from one of the men's machetes striking him, and luckily it was with the broad side of the blade. Iru was very upset with me for taking this picture, and I was to find out later many Jamaicans have a real dislike of having their pictures taken. I have seen many tourists over the years get into trouble with their cameras. Soon after this picture was taken, the police began to patrol the area and soon put a stop to the theft of our sand. It was around this time I decided to document the history and changes taking place in this undeveloped part of Jamaica. I kept a journal and started to film the people and environment with one of the very first video cameras available to the general public. Check out that huge aloe vera plant situated in the front of my doorway. This is the big house, and a resting place of mine for many years. The house was built and donated to the Rastafarians by a gentleman who owned many restaurants in the United States. He also loved the beach, but passed on before he was able to help in its development. It took 5 years for the sand to make its way back to the beauty it had once been, and it continues to grow to this day. As we planted up with incredible fruits and vegetables, and I began to bring in different types of skilled people to help in the development, things started to look very fruitful indeed. Iru, James's younger brother, decided to stay on the beach to watch for the sand thieves, while James and I lived in the mountains and planted up a huge vineyard of food. To this day, it still produces tons of food which is free for all the locals to eat. There were days when we would just want to get away from it all, so we would travel by foot deep into the jungle and live in our mountain vineyard. We called this area the land of look behind. The scenery in Jamaica is stunning and is guaranteed to make you take notice. With the weather being so beautiful that day, it was perfect for a motorcycle ride. My driver left Spring Garden and took some supplies into town. He apparently ran into the back of a pickup truck with my rented 650 Honda. The stitches from his injuries can be clearly seen on his forehead and lips. As it turned out, while we were away at the beach, the man on the right did steal all of James's tobacco. If you look closely, the theft can be clearly seen in his eyes. It is my understanding that the man is now dead. He was brutally murdered over some criminal business activities he had later mixed himself up in. And time still moves on. Here we see my outhouse. Well, you can't really see the toilet because we planted banana around it to make it private and definitely more appealing. Word of mouth travels extremely fast in Jamaica, and that evening we were informed that the alligator who had attacked a little girl a week before was finally captured. It was up for sale at $100 US, if I remember correctly. I don't eat alligator, so we just had pictures taken.
One day, somehow, some way, we'll find a place, your paradise.
Around this time, I started to experiment with black and white photography, using a Pentax camera on a tripod with a 1-minute delay timer. Back then, I would live in a tent for months at a time. It was really quite nice, and the sounds of the jungle were right there all around me. It still gives me pleasant memories and dreams to this day. I soon began to divide all my time between the beach and the jungle, leaving out the tourist resorts completely. James soon grew another beautiful crop of tobacco right out of the rock, and things soon became easier as the days went on. The neighbors would come over and bring me gifts all the time. This is Toneman, who lived just down the way. He would come and get me and take me into the jungle vineyard and give me fruits to eat. There were days I would come out of the bush and have to go directly to the local freshwater spring and have to bathe. I was so sticky and completely covered with the juice from all the fruit I had eaten in the jungle. One of the hardest things I had to endure at these times was the isolation. If it wasn't for my love of writing and reading, I may never have been able to finish what I had started. There were times when the stress got so great, I would feel like walking out this back door here and never looking back. Fortunately, Bongo and James were always there for me. They taught me a positive way to look at my life and somehow were always able to make me feel better. Here's Bongo showing me how to prepare the fruit ackee properly so as not to poison myself. Bongo Bada taught me many things about survival in the jungle among the Rastafarians that I can't even begin to explain. The living jungle can be a brutal place, and there are certain rules one must always abide by. I was taught that the three main things to fear in the jungle were scorpions, spiders, and mankind, and not necessarily in that order. This is the three reasons it became necessary to have two homes in Jamaica, one on the beach and one in the mountains, both with totally different Jamaican views and culture. This way, when one place became stressful or boring, I was able to move to another location and in this way keep my sanity. One day we decided we needed a boat for the beach, so we hired a boat builder for $50 Canadian and had him build me a canoe. He lived in the bush for 3 days, sleeping in the boat under progress. Here we see the cottonwood tree he has picked out for the boat. He began work right away and was finished in the 3 days as he had promised. I would visit him every day to bring him some supplies, including a bottle of white rum to warm him on those lonely Jamaican nights in the bush alone. Notice the pole that is tied across the boat. This stops the boat from splitting open as it dries. All the work to dig out the boat was done by one man with his hands and chisel. He was quite amazing, really, and is well known to the community for his accomplishments in boat building. Now, as we sat there with him in the jungle, He began to tell me stories of the history of the area that we were in. It turned out to be owned at one time by a slave master by the name of George Bedward. He went on to say how the local people believed the gravesite was haunted. I took this as a challenge, and the next day I made my way to the gravesite.
Too much warring and fighting. The heathen don't know the way of uniting.
This journey turned out to be quite the adventure, which I go into detail about the trouble I caused among the local village that day in my published novel, The Comprehensive Jamaican Handbook.
Stay vigilant.
I planted that tree in the foreground there and was amazed at how fast it grew. It is now a giant mango tree providing fruit for all the local children.
Microphone check one.
Sometimes the Jamaican nights were so long and so cold that it was a beautiful feeling to warm yourself up in the morning sun. As once again I would look forward to another day in Jamaica. It had gotten to the point that living in the jungle for so long, sitting on nothing but rocks and logs, I had acquired some dreadful open sores on my derriere. I was fortunate that my first 8-month stay was coming to an end and I would be able to get some medical attention in Canada for my wounds. In the end, pun intended, it was all well worth it. The local people called this place Mount Zion, as it was the highest area for miles around. It has only one path to reach the summit, which just happens to lay behind the back of my house. Here I am on the top of Mount Zion, checking out a seedbed that needed water. There was a drought at that time, and you can notice some of the plants starting to dry out in the foreground. And here we see the Cinco Bible. This cactus is primarily used for shampooing your hair. Just slice it in half and scrub your head. It's quite wonderful, smelly, and soapy. The place that you are seeing here has many different names and is the main path to the interior jungle in the Spring Garden area. The path leads 4,000 feet straight up and has the well-deserved names of Broken Bone Alley, the Blood Chute, or my favorite, So Long Hole.
I'm gonna take it to the limit, and the whole world.
At times it felt as if I had gone back 400 years in time to a different era and was watching history unfold before me.
It is real. I know that I must face the public.
Fresh water in the jungle is of the utmost importance for survival. Here we see a wild pine, which if you were to reach inside you could find fresh water at its base. Be careful of the trapdoor spider that might be living inside though.
Take a stand. Never gonna give them another chance. What?
Finally my tour was done and Deb had come from Canada to pick me up. In all my excitement, I had her pose for this picture in the sugarcane field just after telling her horror stories of scorpions and spiders. Needless to say, she wasn't too impressed with the idea of standing in this open field.
About the logic, all the truth will come to pass.
She soon began to relax, but occasionally would still worry about bugs. Here she is looking for scorpions, after I told her they like to live in the warmth of the shoe, and one should always check their footgear when it's left outside in the jungle overnight.
What they gonna do when we take a stand?
It didn't take long until she warmed to James, and they became lifelong friends. Here he is showing her that the breadfruit is ripe, and that's what we will be eating for supper tonight. Roasted breadfruit with ackee and saltfish. Mmm. I went over to the mango tree and picked the biggest and fattest mangoes for Debbie's welcome to Jamaica party. She had brought lots of gifts for the children, like medicine and clothing, including this beautiful bicycle for the children to ride.
I really love you, woman.
We we decided it would be nice to take her on a boat ride to see a place called Booby Key. This is a small island that lays just a short distance off the coast of Jamaica. So we loaded up the boat and headed out to sea. In the background is the west end of Negril, which as you can see is just under development. 3 years later, work began in earnest and the whole front of the west end began to look like this. The back part, well, that's a different story and one that tourists rarely experience. I had free access to this property as Bongo Bada's sons had built this castle. The manager let me have run of the place whenever the owner was out of town. He had a great respect for the Cocker family and anyone who was in their care. We soon reached Booby Key and admired this beautiful 7-mile-long beach in the distance, which is known as Negril. It is the longest white sand beach in the world. The water runs so fast and deep in places that it is important to have someone with you that has knowledge of the sea. I was fortunate to have these 2 seasoned sailors as my guides and friends. I will never forget that day. It was a perfect moment in time, and I still dream about it to this day. Deb began to truly relax when she started to experience the high energy of Jamaica life on the beach. Party after party can be found with over 200 reggae bars stretching along the 7 miles of pure white sand beach. Beach life for a tourist is laid back. Deb soon shed her street clothes and put on her bathing attire. We all had a really good meal that we had brought with us, and after lunch Deb decided to relax in this very strange looking tree.
Sunshine lady, drive me crazy when sunshiny, miss you smile.
She was very nervous at that time, and she was always giving me this looks like, please George, don't embarrass me. All in all, it was a beautiful day, one of those times that sticks in your mind forever, although you didn't realize it was so important at that time. It was just one of those days I couldn't take a bad picture. Roll after roll came off with excellent results.
Sunshine lady, when sunshiny, miss you smiley.
Then the sun just seemed to melt away, and it was soon time to leave.
Sunshiny, miss you smiley. But no, the rain fall, in a smile more.
We began our journey back this time heading to South Broughton to show Debbie what our private beach looked like, now that we had done farming and cleaning up. She told me she was very impressed as the property was starting to take on a look of importance and prosperity. An era of fruitfulness was starting to take hold, and a new beginning was about to unfold. Deb soon realized that she was the first Canadian woman the people had ever met in South Broughton, and some of the children she met were mistrustful. Here is James's son Kevin trying to convince his cousin that I'm not the white devil in stories told around the campfire. This is the boy's father, Shirley. We soon became good friends as he was James's brother and took a strong liking to me. And here is Seabird. He was the hired cook for the property at the time. We then took Deb to show her one of the buildings that I had under construction and told her of my dream to build a private school. It just so happened to be close to the local constable, so she had a chance to meet him and his family. The Jamaican people have always welcomed my guests with love and open arms to this incredibly beautiful and unspoiled south part of Jamaica.
Well,
I told them that when electricity had first come to the area, it was such an event that I had to go out and take a picture of the only hydro wire. It was nice to see the children finally get some comfort, and it was equally pleasant to finally have a fridge and ice on the property.
This is why I tell brothers and sisters stay up in our school, cause no idiots walk around with them.
Our stay in Jamaica was coming to an end, so we made our way into the jungle for one last day before our flight.
It's like a song track, it keep going on back to back in 1996.
In the morning, I just had time to snap off a couple more pics before I had to leave.
One like them think it can't stop, so we need fair president, brand new resident.
I snapped James harvesting the last of his tobacco. That smoke is strong, let me tell you. I climbed up into the mountain and went into Zion one last time to give my respects to Bongo Bada. Telling myself that one day I would return to live on the beach and in the mountains that I love so well. Mr. Somerville, please refrain from telling people that I do not own a piece of the Berlin Wall. I can assure you 100% that my rock is legitimate Berlin Wall. How can you tell people it's not?
But I got a piece of the Berlin Wall here.
Well, why do you say that this piece of Berlin Wall is any different than my uncle's piece of Berlin Wall?
Because I get this piece from a guy who was right beside the wall when it was tearing down.
And they said that this was what, the last piece?
This was the last piece of the chocolate white piece.